The castle gates groaned open in the pre-dawn darkness, revealing a figure that would haunt Sarah Wilson's memory forever. A knight staggered forward, his armor dented and streaked with crimson that caught the torchlight like liquid fire. In his arms, wrapped in blood-stained cloth, was a bundle so small it seemed impossible it could contain life. The baby's cry pierced the morning air, a sound both fragile and fierce that made Sarah's heart clench with recognition of desperate need. Charles Miller's legs nearly buckled as he crossed the threshold, his breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged in the cold air. The weight of the child seemed to be the only thing keeping him upright, as if letting go would mean surrendering to the darkness that threatened to claim him. Blood dripped steadily from beneath his armor, leaving a trail across the stone courtyard that would take days to scrub clean. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway of the servants' quarters, her woolen cloak pulled tight against the morning chill. She had risen early to tend the fires, as was her duty in this remote keep where Lord Victoria Torres held court with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. The sight before her defied explanation. Knights did not arrive alone at dawn, covered in gore, carrying infants like precious cargo. Knights did not look at serving women with eyes that held such raw, desperate hope. The baby's cries grew stronger, more insistent, and Sarah found herself moving forward without conscious thought. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold stones as she approached the swaying figure. Up close, she could see that Charles Miller was young, perhaps no more than 25, with dark hair matted to his skull and a face that spoke of noble birth despite the grime and exhaustion etched into every line. "Please," he whispered, the single word carrying the weight of a prayer. His voice was rough, as if he had been shouting commands or screaming in battle for hours. "The child needs care. I have nowhere else to turn. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The story of what brought this bloodied night to Sarah's door is one that will test every belief about duty, mercy, and the bonds that form in the darkest hours." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the bundle, feeling the warmth of the tiny body through the stained fabric. The baby was a girl, perhaps 3 months old, with dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a small face. She had stopped crying the moment Sarah took her, as if recognizing safety in the gentle touch of calloused but caring hands. "Where did she come from?" Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would bring more questions than comfort. Charles Miller's knees finally gave way, and he sank to the stones with a clatter of armor that echoed through the courtyard. "Her mother was my sister," he said, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "Lady Margaret Miller, wed to Lord Frank James of Blackmore Keep. She died in childbirth 3 days past, and her husband—" His voice broke, and Sarah saw tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. "Her husband declared the child cursed, said she brought death with her first breath. He ordered her thrown from the walls." The horror of it settled over Sarah like ice water. She had heard whispers of Lord Frank James, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his superstition. To declare an innocent babe cursed and order her death was monstrous even by the harsh standards of their world. She looked down at the child in her arms, seeing only perfect innocence and the promise of life that deserved protection. "You took her," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "You defied your brother-in-law and took her." Charles nodded, his head hanging with exhaustion and grief. "I could not stand by and watch. She is my blood, my sister's daughter. Margaret made me swear on her deathbed that I would protect the child if anything happened. I never imagined—" He gestured helplessly at his blood-stained armor. "Frank James declared me a traitor and a thief. His men pursued me for 2 days across the moorlands. I fought them at the river crossing, killed 3 good men who were only following orders. Their blood is on my hands, and for what? To save one small life that the world seems determined to snuff out." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. She had been alone in this world for longer than she cared to remember, cast adrift when her own family died of fever 5 winters past. Lord Victoria Torres had given her shelter and work, but not warmth, not the sense of belonging that every soul craved. Looking at this broken knight and the innocent child he had risked everything to save, she saw an opportunity for something she had thought lost forever. The chance to matter, to make a difference in lives that hung by the thinnest of threads. "Can you stand?" she asked Charles, shifting the baby to one arm and extending her other hand to help him rise. He looked up at her with surprise, as if he had expected rejection or demands for explanation. When he took her offered hand, Sarah felt the tremor of exhaustion that ran through his entire body. His grip was strong despite his wounds, the hand of a man accustomed to wielding sword and shield in defense of others. "I have a small chamber in the servants' quarters," Sarah said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not observed. "Lord Torres is away on progress to the capital, and most of the household sleeps still. You can rest there, tend your wounds. The child needs feeding. And I know something of caring for infants." Charles Miller stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw something kindle in his dark eyes that might have been hope. "You would do this for strangers who bring nothing but trouble to your door?" "You bring a child who needs protection," Sarah replied simply. "That is enough." Together they made their way across the courtyard, Charles leaning heavily on Sarah's shoulder while she cradled the baby against her chest. The stone steps leading to the servants' quarters seemed endless, each one a monumental effort for the wounded knight. Sarah could feel the dampness seeping through his armor, where blood continued to flow from wounds she could not yet assess. Her chamber was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a wooden chest for her few possessions, and a hearth that she quickly coaxed to life. The flickering flames threw dancing shadows on the walls as Sarah helped Charles remove his armor, piece by piece revealing the extent of his injuries. A deep gash ran along his left shoulder, another across his ribs, and his hands were cut from gripping his sword through desperate combat. "These need cleaning and binding," Sarah said, examining the wounds with the practical eye of someone who had tended injuries before. "The bleeding must be stopped, or you will not see another dawn." As she worked, cleaning the cuts with water heated over the fire and tearing strips from her spare shift to use as bandages, Charles told her more of his story. He spoke of his sister Margaret, gentle and kind, who had been wed to Lord Frank James as part of a political alliance their father had arranged. The marriage had been troubled from the start, with Frank's volatile temper and dark superstitions making Margaret's life a misery. "She wrote to me often," Charles said, wincing as Sarah cleaned the deepest cut. Her letters grew shorter, more careful, as if she feared who might read them. "When word came that she had died in childbirth, I rode immediately to Blackmore Keep. I arrived to find Frank raving about curses and evil omens, claiming the child had killed her mother through dark magic." The baby had fallen asleep in Sarah's lap as she worked, tiny fists curled against her chest with complete trust. Looking down at the peaceful face, Sarah marveled at the innocence that Lord Frank James had seen as evil. She had helped deliver enough babies in her village to know that childbirth was always dangerous, that women died for reasons that had nothing to do with curses or magic. The loss of a mother was tragedy enough, without adding the persecution of her child. "So now, what will you do now?" Sarah asked as she finished binding Charles's wounds. "Lord Frank James will not simply forget or forgive. If he truly believes you have stolen his child, he will pursue you to the ends of the earth." Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that seemed to age him before Sarah's eyes. "I cannot return to my father's lands. Frank has influence there. Allies who would see me hanged as a traitor. I have some coin, enough perhaps to book passage on a ship to distant shores. But," he looked down at the sleeping baby, "a sea voyage is no place for an infant. She needs stability, care, a woman's touch to help her thrive." Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she understood what he was asking without words. The logical part of her mind screamed warnings about the danger of harboring a fugitive knight and a child declared cursed by a powerful lord. But the deeper part of her soul, the part that had been empty and aching for years, saw an opportunity for redemption that might never come again. "She could stay here," Sarah said quietly. "Lord Torres rarely visits the servants' quarters, and the other staff would not question a foundling taken in from charity. I could say I found her abandoned at the gates, which is truth enough. She could grow up safe, unknown to those who would harm her." Charles's head snapped up, hope and gratitude warring with a concern in his expression. "You would take such a risk? For a child not your own?" Every child deserves a chance at life, Sarah replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Your sister died to bring her into this world. You risked everything to save her from those who would destroy her. The least I can do is offer her a home where she can grow up free from fear. The night was quiet for a long time, and Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Finally, he reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object that caught the firelight. It was a ring, gold set with a deep blue sapphire, clearly valuable and bearing the carved seal of a noble house. This was Margaret's, he said, holding it out to Sarah. Our mothers before her, and her mothers before that. It is all I have left of my family's honor. If you will truly care for the child, raise her as your own, then this is yours. Sell it if you must for her care, or keep it to remember that she comes from noble blood, even if the world would deny her that birthright. Sarah took the ring with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of history and responsibility it represented. The sapphire seemed to hold depths of blue that matched the baby's eyes, as if the stone had been waiting all these years to return to its rightful owner. What is her name? Sarah asked. Margaret named her Marie after our grandmother, Charles replied. Marie Edwards, though she can never safely claim that surname. She will need a new identity, a new beginning. Sarah nodded, understanding the necessity even as her heart ached for the losses this tiny girl would never know she had suffered. Marie Wilson, she said softly. My ward, taken in from charity and raised with love. As if hearing her new name, baby Marie stirred and opened her dark eyes, looking up at Sarah with an expression of perfect trust. In that moment, Sarah felt something fundamental shift in her world. She was no longer just a serving woman existing day by day in quiet desperation. She was a mother, a protector, someone with purpose beyond her own survival. Charles stayed for 3 more days, hidden in Sarah's chamber while his wounds began to heal and his strength slowly returned. During those days, Sarah watched him interact with his niece and saw depths of gentleness she would never have expected from a knight trained for war. He sang to Marie in a low voice, old lullabies his sister had taught him, and told her stories of the family she would never know, but whose love would always be part of her heritage. On the morning of his departure, Charles stood in the doorway fully armed once more, his armor cleaned and his wounds bound beneath fresh clothing. He looked like a different man from the broken figure who had staggered through the gates, though Sarah could see the permanent shadow of grief that would always mark his eyes. I will send word when I can, he promised, though they both knew how dangerous such contact would be. Letters from distant ports, news of my travels. She should know someday that her family did not abandon her by choice. Sarah held Marie close as they watched Charles Miller ride away into the morning mist, his horse's hooves echoing off the cobblestones until distance swallowed the sound. The baby gurgled contentedly, unaware that she was watching her last blood relative disappear into exile. Sarah whispered a prayer for his safety and turned back to face the life they would build together. The first months were the hardest. Marie was a good baby, but infants required constant attention that Sarah had to balance with her duties to the household. She rose before dawn to tend the fires and prepare the morning meal, Marie sleeping in a basket beside her as she worked. The other servants accepted the story of the foundling without question, even offering help when they could spare it. Cook, a motherly woman named Lauren Davis, took special interest in ensuring Marie received proper nourishment as she grew. That child has the look of nobility about her, Lauren observed one day as she watched Marie, now 6 months old, sitting propped among cushions in the kitchen. See how she holds her head, the way she studies everything with those sharp eyes. Mark my words, she comes from good blood, abandoned or not. Sarah's heart clenched with the irony of the observation, but she only smiled and agreed that Marie was indeed a special child. The baby was thriving under her care, growing strong and alert with each passing day. She had her father's dark hair, but her mother's delicate features, and when she smiled, Sarah could see hints of the beauty she would someday possess. Lord Victoria Torres returned from her progress to the capital in late autumn, bringing with her news of political upheaval and shifting alliances that meant nothing to Sarah but everything to the safety of their small family. Frank James had been killed in a border skirmish, his lands passing to a distant cousin who had no interest in pursuing vengeance for old grievances. Charles Miller was officially declared dead. lost in the same battle that had claimed his enemy. The news should have brought relief, but Sarah found herself grieving for the knight who had entrusted his most precious burden to her care. She hoped he was alive somewhere, building a new life under a new name, but she would never know for certain. All she could do was honor his sacrifice by giving Marie the love and protection he had died to secure. As Marie grew from infant to toddler, her personality began to emerge in ways that both delighted and occasionally terrified Sarah. The child was fearless, climbing onto chairs and tables with no regard for the danger of falling. She was also remarkably intelligent, speaking her first words earlier than most children and showing an uncanny ability to understand conversations that should have been beyond her comprehension. "Mama Sarah," Marie said one morning when she was barely 2 years old, tugging on Sarah's skirt as she worked in the garden. "Why do the other children have papas, but I only have you?" Sarah's hands stilled among the herbs she was gathering, her heart aching with the complexity of the truth she could never fully share. She knelt down to Marie's level, looking into those dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young face. "Some families are different," Sarah said gently. "You had a mama and papa who loved you very much, but they had to go away before you were old enough to remember them. They asked me to take care of you, to be your mama, and love you as my own. And I do, little one. You are the most precious thing in my world." Marie considered this with the seriousness that characterized all her thoughts, then nodded as if the explanation satisfied her. She threw her small arms around Sarah's neck and hugged her tightly, and Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the fierce love that filled her chest. The years passed with the steady rhythm of seasons, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Marie learned to read from Sarah's small collection of books, displaying a hunger for knowledge that sometimes worried Sarah with its intensity. The child asked questions about everything, from the movement of stars to the reasons why some people lived in castles while others served in them. "The world is not fair, little one," Sarah explained during one such conversation. When Marie was perhaps 5 years old and had been asking about the differences between nobles and commoners. "Some people are born to wealth and power, while others must work for their bread. But that does not make one person more valuable than another in the eyes of God." Marie absorbed these lessons with the gravity of a much older child, and Sarah began to understand that she was raising someone who would never be content with simple answers or easy explanations. The blood of nobles ran in Marie's veins, even if she could never claim that heritage, and it showed in her bearing, her intelligence, and her instinctive sense of justice. When Marie turned 7, an event occurred that would test everything Sarah had taught her about hiding in plain sight. Lord Victoria Torres announced that she would be hosting a grand feast to celebrate the betrothal of her eldest son, and nobles from across the region would be attending. The household was thrown into chaos as preparations began for the elaborate event. Sarah tried to keep Marie away from the main areas of the castle during the festivities, but the child's curiosity proved stronger than her caution. On the night of the feast, Marie slipped away from their chambers and made her way to the great hall, drawn by the music and laughter that echoed through the stone corridors. Sarah discovered her absence when she went to check on the child before retiring, and panic seized her heart like ice. She searched frantically through the servants' quarters, the kitchens, and the storage rooms, but found no trace of Marie. Finally, driven by desperate intuition, she made her way toward the great hall. She found Marie standing in the shadows near the musician's alcove, her dark eyes wide with wonder as she watched the nobles dance in their fine clothes and glittering jewels. The child was perfectly still, drinking in every detail of the scene before her, and Sarah realized with a chill that Marie looked as if she belonged among them. "Marie," Sarah whispered urgently, reaching for the child's hand. "You must come away. This is not for us." But it was too late. Lord Victoria Torres had noticed the small figure lurking in the shadows, and her sharp eyes had caught the quality of Marie's bearing that set her apart from the other servants' children. She approached with the measured steps of someone accustomed to command, her silk gown rustling with each movement. "And who might this be?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the authority that made even grown men tremble. Sarah's mouth went dry as she struggled to find words that would not betray them both. "My ward, my lady. I apologize for the intrusion. She was curious about the music and slipped away while I was working." Victoria studied Marie with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of noble politics. The child met her stare without flinching, displaying a composure that would have been remarkable in an adult, let alone a 7-year-old. "Your ward," Victoria repeated slowly. "The foundling you took in some years ago." "Yes, my lady." Victoria circled Marie slowly, taking in every detail of her appearance and demeanor. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for the questions that could destroy everything they had built together. "She has the look of quality about her," Victoria said finally. "Good bone structure, intelligent eyes, proper posture despite her humble clothing. Tell me, child, can you read?" Marie nodded solemnly. "Yes, my lady. Mama Sarah taught me." "And what do you read?" "The Bible, my lady, and books of history when Mama Sarah can find them for me." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly at this response. Literacy was uncommon enough among the serving class, but a taste for history suggested an education far beyond what most foundlings could expect. "Interesting," Victoria murmured. She turned back to Sarah, and there was something speculative in her expression that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I think this child has potential that is being wasted in the kitchens and servants' quarters. Perhaps it is time she received an education more suited to her obvious intelligence." Sarah felt the world tilt around her as she understood the implications of Victoria's words. To refuse would be suspicious, but to accept would mean exposing Marie to scrutiny that could reveal her true identity. Yet she had no choice but to agree with whatever her mistress decreed. "You are too generous, my lady," Sarah managed to say. "Generosity has nothing to do with it," Victoria replied crisply. "I have use for intelligent servants, and this child clearly possesses abilities that should be cultivated. She will begin lessons with the castle's tutor tomorrow. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and the basics of household management. If she proves as capable as I suspect, there may be opportunities for advancement in her future." The arrangement that followed changed everything about Marie's daily life, and by extension, Sarah's existence as well. Each morning, Marie would join the castle's tutor, an elderly scholar named Gary Taylor who had served the Torres family for decades. The lessons took place in the castle's library, a room filled with more books than Marie had ever imagined existed. Gary Taylor was a patient teacher who quickly recognized that his newest student possessed an exceptional mind. Marie absorbed knowledge with an eagerness that sometimes alarmed Sarah, who worried that too much learning might make the child dissatisfied with the humble life that was all Sarah could offer her. "She has a gift," Gary told Sarah one afternoon when she came to collect Marie after lessons. "I have taught the children of nobles for 40 years, and few of them showed half the aptitude this child displays. Her memory is extraordinary, her reasoning skills remarkable for her age. Where did you say she came from?" "I found her abandoned at the gates," Sarah replied, sticking to the story that had served them well for so many years. "Perhaps her parents were educated people who fell on hard times." Gary nodded thoughtfully, but Sarah could see the questions in his eyes. "A child did not develop such refined instincts and natural grace simply from good breeding. There were qualities in Marie that spoke of noble blood, and Sarah lived in constant fear that someone would eventually put the pieces together." Meanwhile, Marie flourished under the new arrangement. She devoured everything Gary taught her and begged for more advanced lessons. She learned Latin with startling ease, mastered mathematics that challenged children twice her age, and showed particular interest in the histories of great families and political alliances. "Why do some families have so much power while others have none?" Marie asked Sarah one evening as they sat by the fire in their small chamber. She was 9 years old now, her dark hair growing long and lustrous, her features sharpening into the beauty that had been promised in her infancy. Sarah set down her mending and looked at the child who had become the center of her world. "Power comes from many sources," she said carefully. "Land, wealth, the loyalty of others, knowledge, and sometimes simply the accident of birth. Those born to great families inherit advantages that others must struggle to achieve." "But is that fair?" Marie pressed, her dark eyes intense with the passion that drove all her questions. "Fair or not, it is the way of the world," Sarah replied. We cannot change the circumstances of our birth, but we can choose how we respond to them. A person of humble origin can still live with honor, still make a difference in the lives of others. Marie considered this, as she considered everything, with the gravity of someone far older than her years. "Mama Sarah," she said finally, "do you think my real parents were noble?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she struggled to maintain her composure. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "Master Gary says I have natural instincts that usually come from noble breeding, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see features that seem too refined for a foundling's child. I wonder if perhaps my parents were people of quality who lost their fortune, or who died in some tragedy that left me orphaned." Sarah's heart ached with the weight of secrets she could never share. How could she tell Marie that her instincts were correct, that she was indeed the daughter of nobles, but that claiming that heritage would mean death? How could she explain that the very qualities that made Marie special were also what made her dangerous to those who might recognize her true identity? "Your parents loved you enough to ensure you were safe," Sarah said finally. "That is what matters, not their station in life. You are my daughter now, in every way that counts, and I am proud of the person you are becoming." Marie seemed satisfied with this answer, but Sarah could see that the questions would only grow stronger as the child matured. The day was coming when simple explanations would no longer suffice, when Marie would demand the full truth about her origins. Sarah prayed that when that day arrived, she would find the wisdom to navigate the dangerous waters of revelation without destroying them both. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and deeper bonds between Sarah and Marie. The child grew into a young woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence, her education under Gary Taylor having given her knowledge that rivaled that of many nobles' daughters. She spoke Latin fluently, could calculate complex mathematical problems, and had read more history and literature than most adults would encounter in a lifetime. But with knowledge came questions, and with questions came danger. Marie had begun to notice things that a less observant person might have missed. She saw how certain visiting nobles looked at her with surprise and speculation. She noticed that her natural grace and bearing set her apart from the other servants in ways that mere education could not explain. Most troubling of all, she had begun to dream of a life beyond the castle walls, a life where she could use her abilities for something greater than managing household accounts and organizing supplies. "I want to see the world, Mama Sarah," Marie said on the morning of her 15th birthday. She stood at the window of their chamber, looking out over the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. "I want to visit the great cities, see the universities, perhaps even travel to foreign lands where scholars gather to share knowledge." Sarah felt her heart clench with a familiar mixture of pride and terror. Marie had grown into everything Charles Miller could have hoped for in his sister's daughter: intelligent, compassionate, strong-willed, and beautiful. But those very qualities made her a target for anyone who might recognize the resemblance to her lost family. "The world can be a dangerous place for a young woman traveling alone," Sarah said gently, "and we have a good life here. Lord Victoria has been generous in allowing your education to continue. Perhaps in time you could become a tutor yourself, or manage the household of some noble family." Marie turned from the window, and Sarah was struck by the intensity of her gaze. At 15, she looked remarkably like the portrait of Lady Margaret Millelier that Charles had once described, though Marie had no way of knowing this resemblance existed. "Is that all you think I am capable of?" Marie asked, and there was a note of frustration in her voice that Sarah had never heard before. "Managing someone else's household? Teaching someone else's children? I feel as if there is something greater I am meant to do, some purpose I have not yet discovered." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention back to the window. A party of travelers was approaching the castle gates, their banners indicating they were messengers from the royal court. Such visits were rare and usually meant important news that would affect the entire region. Sarah and Marie joined the other servants gathered in the great hall as Lord Victoria received the royal messengers. The news they brought was momentous. The old king had died without a clear heir, and the realm was being torn apart by competing claims to the throne. Noble families were choosing sides, old alliances were crumbling, and war seemed inevitable. "These are dark times ahead," Victoria announced to her assembled household after the messengers had departed. We must be prepared for anything. The castle's defenses will be strengthened, supplies will be stockpiled, and all must be ready to defend our lands if necessary. As the servants dispersed to begin preparations, Sarah noticed that Marie remained in the great hall, staring at the spot where the royal messengers had stood. There was something in the girl's expression that made Sarah's blood run cold, a look of recognition or understanding that suggested Marie had grasped implications that others had missed. "What is it?" Sarah asked quietly, drawing Marie aside. "The succession crisis," Marie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Master Gary taught me about the royal lineage, the various claims and counterclaims. If what those messengers said is true, then several of the great noble families will be destroyed in the coming war. Their lands will be forfeit, their members scattered or killed." Sarah felt a chill of premonition. "What are you thinking?" Marie looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for her 15 years. "I am thinking that in times of great upheaval, the old rules no longer apply. People can reinvent themselves, claim new identities, rise to positions they never could have achieved in peacetime. And I am thinking that perhaps this is the opportunity I have been waiting for." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Sarah realized that the moment she had been dreading for years had finally arrived. Marie was no longer content to hide in the shadows, to live as a servant when every instinct told her she was meant for something greater. The blood of nobles ran in her veins, and it was calling her to claim her birthright, regardless of the danger. That night, as Sarah lay awake listening to Marie's steady breathing in the bed beside her, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The time for secrets was ending. Marie deserved to know the truth about her origins, about the uncle who had died to save her, about the noble heritage she had been forced to deny. With war coming and the old order crumbling, perhaps there was finally a chance for Marie Edwards to reclaim her true identity. But first, Sarah had to find the courage to tell her the story that began with a bloodied knight carrying a baby through castle gates in the gray light of dawn. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the troubles to come. Sarah rose early, as was her custom, but instead of beginning her daily duties, she sat by the window and watched Marie sleep. In the pale light, the girl looked so much like the description Charles had given of his beloved sister Margaret that Sarah's heart ached with the weight of years of deception. When Marie finally stirred and opened her dark eyes, she found Sarah watching her with an expression of such profound sadness that she sat up immediately, all traces of sleep vanishing from her features. "Mama Sarah, what is wrong? You look as if you have seen a ghost." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that once she spoke the words that had been locked in her heart for 15 years, there would be no going back. "Perhaps I have," she said quietly. "The ghost of a brave knight who died to save the life of a baby girl, and the ghost of the woman I was before that child became the center of my world." Marie's eyes widened with understanding. She had always been perceptive beyond her years, and now Sarah could see that she had grasped the significance of the moment. "You are going to tell me about my parents," Marie said. It was not a question. "I am going to tell you about your family," Sarah replied, "your real family, and why the truth has been too dangerous to share until now." Sarah began with the morning 15 years ago when Charles Miller had staggered through the castle gates, bloodied and desperate, carrying a baby in his arms. She told Marie about Lady Margaret Miller, her gentle nature and tragic marriage to Lord Frank James. She described the superstition and cruelty that had led to Marie being declared cursed, the order for her death, and her uncle's desperate flight to save her. "Your Uncle Charles was a good man," Sarah said, watching Marie's face as the truth unfolded. "He gave up everything for you, his lands, his title, his very identity. He became a fugitive and eventually died in exile, all so that you could live and grow up safely." Marie listened in silence, her face growing pale as she absorbed the magnitude of what Sarah was revealing. When Sarah finished speaking, the girl sat perfectly still for a longer moment, staring down at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I am Marie Edwards," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "daughter of Lady Margaret Miller and Lord Frank James, niece of Sir Charles Miller, who died to save me." "You are," Sarah confirmed, "but you are also Marie Wilson, the foundling I raised with love, the daughter of my heart, if not my blood. Nothing can change that. Marie looked up at Sarah with tears glistening in her dark eyes. Why tell me now? What has changed? Sarah gestured toward the window where the storm clouds continued to gather. War is coming, the old order is crumbling, and in the chaos that follows, opportunities will arise that have not existed for generations. You have the education, the intelligence, and the bearing to claim a place in whatever new world emerges from the conflict. But you also have the right to choose your own path, to decide whether you want to reclaim your noble heritage or continue living as my daughter. Marie stood and walked to the window, her movements graceful and purposeful in a way that spoke of her true breeding. She stared out at the darkening sky for a long time before speaking again. Lord Frank James is dead, she said finally. The man who ordered my death as an infant cannot harm me now. But there may be others who would see me as a threat, or who would try to use my bloodline for their own purposes. There may be, Sarah agreed. That is why the choice must be yours. I will support whatever you decide, but I cannot make this decision for Yukum. Marie turned back to face Sarah, and there was something in her expression that reminded Sarah powerfully of the determined knight who had risked everything to save her. I need time to think, Marie said. This changes everything I thought I knew about myself, about my place in the world. Sarah nodded, understanding completely. The revelation she had just shared would reshape Marie's entire understanding of her identity and her future. It was not a decision that could be made quickly or lightly. Over the following days, as the castle prepared for the possibility of war, Sarah watched Marie struggle with the weight of her newfound knowledge. The girl threw herself into her studies with renewed intensity, reading everything Gary Taylor could provide about the political situation and the various noble families involved in the succession crisis. She asked careful questions about genealogy and inheritance law, clearly trying to understand how her bloodline might fit into the complex web of alliances and enmities that would shape the coming conflict. A week after Sarah's revelation, news arrived that would force Marie's hand sooner than either of them had expected. A messenger brought word that Michael Myers, a distant cousin of the Miller family, had declared himself the rightful heir to Charles Miller's lands and titles. He was gathering supporters and planned to press his claim once the succession crisis was resolved, arguing that Charles had died without legitimate heirs. He is wrong, Marie said quietly as she and Sarah discussed the news in the privacy of their chamber. Charles Miller had a legitimate heir, his sister's daughter, born in wedlock and entitled to inherit through the female line if no male heirs exist. Sarah felt her heart sink as she recognized the determination in Marie's voice. You would reveal yourself? Risk everything to claim lands that have been forfeit for 15 years? I would claim what is rightfully mine, Marie replied, her chin lifting with unconscious pride. Not for wealth or power, but for justice. My uncle died believing that his sacrifice would give me a chance at life. How can I honor that sacrifice by hiding in the shadows forever? Before Sarah could respond, another commotion erupted in the courtyard below. This time, the visitors were not royal messengers, but a group of armed knights bearing the colors of various noble houses. Sarah and Marie watched from their window as the party was admitted to the castle. Their leader, a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Lord Gary Taylor's nephew, Marie observed, recognizing the man from descriptions her tutor had given. Sir Jack Cook, a knight of considerable reputation who has remained neutral in the succession crisis. What could bring him here? They soon learned the answer when Lord Victoria summoned the entire household to the Great Hall. Sir Jack Cook stood beside her, his weathered face grave as he addressed the assembled servants and retainers. I bring word from the capital, he announced. The succession crisis has taken a new turn. Several of the great noble houses have been destroyed in the fighting, their bloodlines extinguished or scattered. In the chaos, many ancient claims are being pressed, and the new king, whoever he may ultimately be, will need to sort through competing demands for lands and titles. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd as if looking for something specific. I am here on behalf of certain parties who have an interest in resolving some of these claims peacefully. Specifically, I seek information about the fate of the Miller family line. There are rumors that Sir Charles Miller may have had living relatives when he died. relatives whose existence could complicate current attempts to claim his lands. Sarah felt Marie tense beside her, and she reached out instinctively to grasp the girl's hand in warning. This was exactly the kind of scrutiny they had feared, the moment when Marie's existence could become known to those who might see her as either a valuable asset or a dangerous threat. But Marie had already made her choice. She stepped forward, moving with the grace and confidence that had always marked her as different from the other servants. The great hall fell silent as she walked toward Sir Jack Cook, every eye in the room following her progress. "Sir Jack," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I believe I can provide the information you seek." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched her adopted daughter stand before the assembled knights and nobles. Marie looked every inch the noblewoman she was born to be, her bearing proud and her gaze unflinching as she faced the man who could determine her fate. "I am Marie Edwards," she continued, using her true surname for the first time since infancy, "daughter of Lady Margaret Miller and Lord Frank James, niece of Sir Charles Miller, who died in exile 15 years ago. I am the last legitimate heir of the Miller bloodline, and I have come forward to claim what is rightfully mine." The silence that followed her declaration was profound, broken only by the sound of Sarah's sharp intake of breath and the whisper of fabric as people shifted to get a better look at the young woman who had just announced herself as the heir to a supposedly extinct noble line. Sir Jack Cook studied Marie with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent decades evaluating the truth of various claims and counterclaims. His eyes took in her bearing, her features, the unconscious authority in her voice, and Sarah could see him reaching conclusions that would reshape the political landscape of the region. "You claim to be the daughter of Lady Margaret Miller," he said finally. "Can you prove this claim?" Marie reached into the small leather pouch she wore at her belt and withdrew the sapphire ring that Charles Miller had given to Sarah 15 years ago. The stone caught the light from the great hall's torches, its deep blue depths seeming to hold all the history and pain of the Miller family line. "This ring belonged to my mother," Marie said, holding it up for all to see, "and to her mother before her and her mother's mother. It bears the seal of the Miller house and has been passed down through the female line for generations. My Uncle Charles gave it to the woman who saved my life and raised me as her own daughter, with instructions that it should be kept as proof of my heritage should the day ever come when it was safe for me to claim my birthright." Sir Jack Cook took the ring and examined it carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful with each passing moment. Sarah could see recognition in his eyes as he studied the intricate carving and the quality of the sapphire they went there. This was clearly a piece he had seen before, or at least heard described in detail. "I knew your uncle," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of respect that had been absent before. "Charles Miller was a man of honor who died far from home, branded a traitor for choosing conscience over duty. If you are truly his niece, then you have inherited more than just his lands and titles. You have inherited his courage and his commitment to justice." Marie lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I hope to prove worthy of that inheritance, my lord." Sir Jack nodded slowly, then turned to address Lord Victoria Torres, who had been watching the proceedings with the sharp attention of someone calculating political advantages and risks. "My lady," he said formally, "it appears that your household has been harboring a most interesting guest. If this young woman's claim proves legitimate, and I believe it will upon further investigation, then she is entitled to significant holdings and a voice in the political arrangements that will follow the resolution of the succession crisis." Victoria's eyes glittered with the kind of calculating intelligence that had kept her family in power through decades of political upheaval. "Indeed," she said smoothly, "I am honored to have provided sanctuary for Lady Marie Edwards during her years of exile. Perhaps we should discuss how this revelation might benefit all parties involved." Sarah watched the interplay between the nobles with growing unease. She had hoped that Marie's revelation would bring justice and recognition, but she was beginning to understand that it would also bring new dangers. Marie was no longer just a foundling with noble blood. She was now a political asset whose value would be determined by how useful she could be to those in power. Over the following days, as Sir Jack Cook conducted his investigation into Marie's claims, Sarah found herself caught between pride in her adopted daughter's courage and terror at the forces that were now swirling around them. Messengers rode back and forth between the castle and various seats of power, carrying documents and testimonies that would determine Marie's fate. Gary Taylor, the elderly tutor who had educated Marie, proved to be an invaluable witness. He testified to her intelligence and natural grace, confirming that she possessed the kind of refined instincts that spoke of noble breeding. More importantly, he was able to provide details about the Miller family history that only someone with intimate knowledge of their genealogy could know. The girl has asked me questions over the years that revealed a deep understanding of noble lineages and political alliances, he told Sir Jack during one of their interviews. At the time, I attributed it to natural curiosity and exceptional intelligence. Now I understand that she was unconsciously seeking information about her own heritage. Meanwhile, Marie threw herself into preparing for the role she had chosen to claim. She studied maps of the Miller lands, memorized the names and histories of the families who had served her ancestors, and learned the complex web of obligations and privileges that came with noble rank. Sarah watched her transformation with a mixture of amazement and loss, seeing the servant girl she had raised disappearing into the noblewoman Marie had always been destined to become. "Are you certain this is what you want?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat together in what might be one of their last quiet moments alone. "Once you take up the mantle of Lady Marie Edwards, there will be no going back to the simple life we shared." Marie looked at her with eyes that held both love and determination. "I am certain," she said quietly, "but that does not mean I will forget where I came from, or who raised me with such love and sacrifice. You will always be my true mother, Mama Sarah, regardless of what titles I may claim or what duties I may assume." The investigation concluded favorably for Marie, with Sir Jack Cook declaring himself satisfied that her claim was legitimate. Documents were prepared, seals were affixed, and arrangements were made for Marie to travel to the capital to present herself formally to the new king and claim her inheritance. On the morning of her departure, Marie stood in the courtyard wearing the fine clothes that Lord Victoria had provided, her dark hair arranged in the elaborate style befitting a noblewoman. The sapphire ring gleamed on her finger, no longer hidden but worn openly as a symbol of her reclaimed identity. Sarah embraced her one final time, feeling the weight of 15 years of love and sacrifice in that moment. "Be safe," she whispered. "Be wise. Remember that true nobility comes not from blood or titles, but from how we treat those who have less power than ourselves." "I will remember," Marie promised, "and I will return when I can. This is not goodbye forever, only farewell for now." As the party of knights and nobles rode away from the castle, Sarah stood watching until they disappeared into the distance. She thought of the bloodied knight who had staggered through those same gates 15 years ago, carrying a baby whose life he had risked everything to save. Charles Miller had died believing that his sacrifice would give his niece a chance at life. Now Sarah realized Marie was finally living up to the full potential of that gift. Months passed before Sarah received word of Marie's success at court. The new king, grateful for the support of noble houses that had remained loyal during the succession crisis, had confirmed Marie's claim to the Miller lands and titles. She was now Lady Marie Edwards in truth as well as name, with holdings that made her one of the more significant landowners in the region. But the letter that brought this news also contained something more precious than any political victory. Marie had not forgotten her promise to return, and she was coming back to the castle where she had grown up, bringing with her plans that would change both their lives once again. "My dearest Mama Sarah," the letter read, "I have reclaimed my birthright, but I have not forgotten the debt I owe to the woman who gave me life when my own family could not. I am establishing a new household at Miller Keep, and I want you to come with me as my chief advisor and companion, not as a servant, but as the honored member of my family that you have always been. The castle that will be our home has room for both our histories, and I need your wisdom as I learn to navigate the responsibilities that come with power." When Marie arrived at the castle a week later, she came not as a fugitive or a foundling, but as a lady of rank traveling with her own retinue. Sarah barely recognized the confident young woman who dismounted from her horse and strode across the courtyard with the bearing of someone born to command. But when Marie saw Sarah waiting for her, all the noble composure fell away, and she ran forward like the child she had once been, throwing her arms around the woman who had raised her with such devotion. "I told you I would come back," Marie said, tears streaming down her face. "I told you this was not goodbye forever." Sarah held her tightly, marveling at the journey that had brought them from that desperate dawn 15 years ago to this moment of triumph and reunion. The bloodied knight who had entrusted his niece to her care could never have imagined that his sacrifice would lead to such an outcome. "Your uncle would be proud," Sarah whispered. "Charles Miller died believing that he was saving the life of one innocent child. He could not have known that he was preserving the future of an entire noble line." As they prepared to leave for Miller Keep together, Sarah reflected on the strange turns that life could take. She had been a simple serving woman, content with her humble existence, until fate brought her a baby who needed protection. In choosing to give that child love and care, she had found purpose and meaning beyond anything she could have imagined. Now she was embarking on a new chapter, not as a servant, but as the trusted advisor to a young noblewoman whose wisdom and compassion had been shaped by years of living among common people. Marie would bring to her role as a landowner an understanding of how power affected those without it, and Sarah would be there to help her remember those lessons when the privileges of rank threatened to obscure them. The story that had begun with a knight's desperate ride through the night had become something larger than any of them could have foreseen. It was a tale of sacrifice and love, of courage in the face of impossible odds, and of the bonds that form between people when they choose to care for one another despite the risks. As their carriage rolled away from the castle where they had spent so many years together, Sarah looked back once at the gates where Charles Miller had first appeared, bloodied and desperate, carrying the future in his arms. The knight was gone, but his legacy lived on in the remarkable young woman beside her, and in the love that had grown between a servant and a foundling who had become mother and daughter in every way that mattered. The road ahead stretched toward Miller Keep and whatever challenges awaited them there. But Sarah faced the future without fear. She had learned that love could triumph over even the darkest circumstances, that courage could be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the greatest nobility was found not in bloodlines or titles, but in the simple act of caring for those who needed protection. Marie Edwards had reclaimed her birthright, but she had not forgotten the lessons learned in humble circumstances. Together, they would build a new kind of legacy, one founded on justice, compassion, and the understanding that true strength came not from power over others, but from the willingness to use whatever advantages one possessed in service of those who had less. The knight's sacrifice had been vindicated. The baby he had saved had grown into a woman of honor and wisdom, and the servant who had opened her heart to a stranger's child had found her own nobility in the act of loving without reservation. Their story was ending where it had begun, with hope for the future and the knowledge that even in the darkest times, courage and compassion could light the way forward.